This week's exercise focused on the difference between the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was undertaken by diaspora Jews in the mid-3rd to mid-2nd century BC. Now, for this exercise, I asked you all to compare the NRSV against the NETS. The New Revised Standard Version is based on the Hebrew text, the critically edited, but essentially the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, whereas the NETS, the New English translation of the Septuagint, is an English translation of the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was current in the early centuries of this era. A few words about the exercise itself. Obviously, we're not really interested in the stylistic differences between these two English translations, because the focal point of the essay, of the exercise rather, is the difference between the Hebrew and the Greek text as these translations represent those differences. So unlike week 1 and its exercise, the style, the fluidity, the contemporary English versus more stilted English, these observations really are a leftover from last week. They're not pertinent to this week's exercise. What is pertinent would be the differences that you observe between essentially between two versions of the same text that were current in the 1st century of our era. I say essentially because the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text on which the NRSV is based, actually is a 5th century AD or somewhat later edited Hebrew text put together by rabbinic scholars known as Masoretes, hence Masoretic text. However, the accuracy of their work and the conservative nature of their work, that is to say, the reliability of the Masoretes preserving much older readings, preserving essentially the Hebrew text as it had been received centuries before, has been largely confirmed by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls include among them hundreds of biblical manuscripts, almost all of which are in Hebrew, a few of which are actually manuscripts of snippets of the Septuagint, which is really an odd thing to find in caves in the Judean desert. Nevertheless, the Dead Sea Scrolls versions of the Hebrew Bible largely give us confidence in the Masoretic text. They do raise some interesting variants, some interesting alternative readings, and since those readings are clearly 1st century BC or 1st century AD readings, as opposed to the Masoretic text, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has in fact changed the shape of the Hebrew Bible as it's been critically edited and as it is currently translated. The NRSV actually benefited from a lot of those Dead Sea Scroll inspired changes to the later Masoretic text. The Septuagint is actually of some value to Old Testament textual criticism, because once one gets past the translational principles of the various translators that did the work, one has essentially a translated witness to what the Old Testament was like in the 2nd century BC and the 1st century BC. That is to say, even though it's a Greek translation, it does tell us something about some Hebrew manuscripts, because the Greek translators had to work from something. It tells us something about at least some Hebrew manuscripts in the mid-3rd to mid-2nd century BC. So all of that to say, as we come to Jeremiah 10, 1-10, we have two versions of this passage. And as most of you noted, after I sent out my spoiler email, it's not just what's there that's important, it's what's not there that's important. And in the Septuagint, verses 6 through 8 are not represented at all. You have basically verses 1 through 5 and verse 9, and verse 9 appears earlier in the paragraph. In fact, it interrupts what we would think of as verse 5, rather than coming later. There's also no verse 10 in the Septuagint. So, the answer to the question, how do these read differently, is a fairly obvious one. In the Septuagint version of Jeremiah, we only have a denunciation of idols in this passage. So it's very straightforward, it's very streamlined, no digressions. In the Masoretic text, we have a passage that alternates between the denunciation of idols and the praise of the one true God. We get through the first 5 verses, and it's all denunciation of idols, as it is also in the Septuagint. But then we get this 2-verse praise of the one God, followed by a return to the theme of the stupidity of idols and their followers. Then we have verse 9, which appears in both, although in a different position in the Septuagint. Again, about the physical sources of idols, that they come from metal and they're worked up into gods by skilled human beings. And then a closing verse in the Hebrew that isn't in the Septuagint, in the Masoretic text that isn't in the Septuagint. A closing verse returning to the praise, the declaration of the one true God by contrast. Now, of course, if you read the whole of Jeremiah, Jeremiah says a lot about the one true God by contrast. So the issue is not, is the Septuagint more reticent to talk about God? No, of course not. But in this one passage, we have very different representations in the Hebrew versus the Greek. And both of these text families were alive side by side in the first century. Paul, in some contexts, could have read the proto-Masoretic text version of Jeremiah 10, the fatter version, the longer version, the one with the bonus scenes. And in Greek contexts, Greek-speaking contexts, he would have encountered Jeremiah 10 as we have it in the Septuagint, the streamlined, the edited version, if you will, possibly. So, and there aren't really right or wrong answers to the questions that followed in this exercise. What do you make of this? One takeaway would be a lot of people in the first century were less concerned about variant textual traditions than we might be. Think, for example, of the King James only controversy. The King James Version has some material, not a ton, but some material, that you don't find in the NRSV and other modern translations. This is because of the work of textual criticism. Those who are critics of the KJV could come out like, why would you want to read a Bible that has stuff in it that wasn't in the original texts? It's a Bible that has some commentary slipped in. Promoters of the King James Version would say, why do you want to read another Bible that doesn't have these important verses? But Paul, for example, with his ability to go from versions of a book in the Septuagint to versions of the book as known in the Masoretic text, to versions of a book that don't line up with known text traditions, perhaps because he's paraphrasing on the fly, perhaps just like I will do when I try to quote a verse but don't do it woodenly according to one or another textual tradition. Paul would be like, well, King James Version with its added material is useful on some occasions, and the New Revised Standard Version with its more carefully curated, only ancient material is more useful in some purposes, and I'm just going to get on with the work that God has for me to do. I hasten to add, personally, I think it's fine for Paul to say that because he had an encounter with the glorified, resurrected Lord and was just, I gotta say it, more closely attuned to God and the Holy Spirit than I think I will ever be. And to be perfectly honest, than I think any of you will ever be. So I promote more safeguards on us than I would on Paul. I will cut Paul a whole lot of slack given his experience and stature in the faith, given that my entire understanding of the Christian faith is dependent upon him, for example. Nevertheless, it does suggest a certain relaxedness on the part of some. I hasten to add, this is not a relaxedness that we find on the part of everyone, because the Septuagint had its stark critics in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. In fact, after the fall of the Jerusalem temple, the second destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans, once they kind of got their act together, rabbis issued fresh translations of the Old Testament in Greek in an attempt to replace the use of the defective, in their opinion, the defective Septuagint among Jewish communities throughout the diaspora. All right, in regards to what Jeremiah actually wrote, there is something of a conundrum here. The NRSV and modern translations tend to default to the Hebrew text, but we might want to consider the question whether actually the Septuagint preserves the more original version of Jeremiah. And the version that we have passed down to us through the Hebrew text tradition is a piously enlarged version. The argument could go either way. I personally think that there's merit in thinking that Jeremiah 10 was originally simply a well-focused assault on idolatry, and that this well-focused assault on idolatry became an occasion to insert the praise of the one God by contrast. However, one could make the other argument, and in fact, implicitly at least, those who prefer the Hebrew text do make this argument, namely that an originally bifurcated passage, which was part denunciation of idols, part praise of the one God, was edited, maybe when the Septuagint was translated, maybe by a Hebrew copyist prior to the Septuagint, to basically eliminate the digressions in praise of God. The purpose of this exercise is not to solve the question, but simply to raise that observation. It is interesting to me that Jeremiah in the Septuagint is fully an eighth shorter than it is in the Masoretic text, which at the very least suggests that there was a shorter and a longer edition of Jeremiah floating side by side in the centuries before Christ and still in the centuries after his coming. A lot of the other differences that you all noted, or some of the other differences, I really can't account for as I look at this page. One of you noted that the Hebrew text had nations where the Septuagint had heathen. My guess is that that person didn't use the New English translation of the Septuagint, because the word heathen is just not in here. It's also nations. Even so, he might have been using Brenton's older translation from the mid-19th century, around the time of the Civil War, actually, but in Britain, so there wasn't nearly as much going on over there. People had time to translate the Septuagint. And then what struck me as an actually very interesting observation, one of you mentioned that in one version it's scarecrows in a cucumber field and another scarecrows in a melon patch. But I don't see anything to do with either cucumbers or melons in the Septuagint. So again, my guess there is that person was comparing two different English translations based on the Masoretic text. So it was comparing cucumbers and melons. Sorry, comparing two English translations of the same Hebrew base text, and the issue is simply some uncertainty as to what the Hebrew word here refers to. Does it refer to a cucumber, or does it refer to a melon? Personally, I wouldn't think that could be too confusing, but apparently in Hebrew it is. So those observations, while interesting at first, seem to be based on not on a comparison of the Hebrew versus the Greek.